Hello, we're going on to The Borrowers, Chapter 6. I hope that you enjoy our story today. Here we go. Chapter 6. Your mother and I got up, said Pod, to tell you about upstairs. Arrietty, holding the great cup in both hands, looked at him over the edge. Pod coughed. You said a while back that the sky was dark brown with cracks in it. Well, it isn't. He looked at her almost accusingly. It's blue. I know, said Arrietty. You know, exclaimed Pod. Yes, of course I do. I've got the grating. Can you see the sky through the grating? Go on, interrupted Homily. Tell her about the gates. Well, said Pod ponderously, if you go outside this room, what do you see? A dark passage, said Arrietty. And what else? Other rooms? And if you go farther, more passages? And if you go walking on in all the passages under the floor, however they twist and turn, what do you find? Gates, said Arrietty. Strong gates, said Pod. Gates you can't open. What are they there for? Against the mice, said Arrietty. Yes, agreed Pod uncertainly, as though he gave her half a mark. But mice never hurt no one. What else? Rats, suggested Arrietty. We don't have rats, said Pod. What about cats? Cats, echoed Arrietty, surprised. Or to keep you in, suggested Pod. To keep me in, repeated Arrietty, dismayed. Upstairs is a dangerous place, said Pod. And you, Arrietty, you're all we've got, see? It's like Hendry. He still has 2 of his own and 2 of hers. Once, said Pod, Hendry had 3 of his own. Your father's thinking of Egeltina, said Homily. Yes, said Pod, Egeltina. They never told her about upstairs, and they hadn't got no grating. They told her the sky was nailed up like with cracks in it. A foolish way to bring up a child, murmured Homily. She sniffed slightly and touched Arrietty's hair. But Egeltina was no fool, said Pod. She didn't believe them. So one day, he went on, she went upstairs to see for herself. How did she get out? Asked Arrietty, interested. Well, we didn't have so many gates then, just the one under the clock. Hendry must have left it unlocked or something. Anyway, Egeltina went out. In a blue dress, said Homily, and a pair of button boots your father made her. Yellow kid with jet beads for buttons. Lovely they were. Well, said Pod, any other time it might have been all right. She'd have gone out, had a look around, had a bit of fright, maybe, and come back, none the worse and no one the wiser. But things had been happening, said Homily. Yes, said Pod. She didn't know, as they never told her, that her father had been seen, and that upstairs they had got a cat. Yes, said Pod, she didn't know, as they never told her, that her father had been seen, and that upstairs they had got in the cat, and... They waited a week, said Homily, and they waited a month, and they hoped for a year, but no one ever saw Egeltina no more. And that, said Pod after a pause and eyeing Arrietty, is what happened to Egeltina. There was silence except for Pod's breathing and the faint bubble of the soup. It just broke up your Uncle Hendry, said Homily at last. He never went upstairs again, in case, he said, he found the button boots. Their only future was to emigrate. Arrietty was silent a moment. Then she raised her head. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Why did you tell me? She asked. Now, tonight. Homily got up. She moved restlessly toward the stove. We don't never talk about it, she said. At least not much. But tonight we felt. She turned suddenly. Well, we'll just say it straight out. Your father's been seen, Arrietty. Said Arrietty. By who? Who by? Well, by a something you've never heard of. But that's not the point. The point is, you think they'll get a cat? They may, said Homily. Arrietty set down the soup for a moment. She stared into the cup as it stood beside her, almost knee-high on the floor. There was a dreamy, secret something about her lowered face. Couldn't we emigrate, she ventured at last, very softly. Homily gasped and clasped her hands and swung away toward the wall. You don't know what you're talking about, she cried, addressing a frying pan which hung there. Worms and weasels and cold and damp and... But supposing, said Arrietty, that I went out like Eglantine did and the cat ate me. Then you and Papa would emigrate, wouldn't you? She asked, and her voice faltered. Wouldn't you? Homily swung around again, this time toward Arrietty. Her face looked very angry. I shall smack you, Arrietty Clock, if you don't behave yourself this minute. Arrietty's eyes filled with tears. I was only thinking, she said, that I'd like to be there, to emigrate too. Uneaten, she added softly as the tears fell. Now, said Pod, this is enough. You get off to bed, Arrietty, uneaten and uneaten both, and unbeaten both, and we'll talk about it in the morning. It's not that I'm afraid, cried Arrietty angrily. I like cats. I bet the cat didn't eat Eglantine. I bet she just ran away because she hated being cooped up day after day, week after week, year after year, like I do, she added on a sob. Cooped up, repeated Homily, astounded. Arrietty put her face into her hands. Gates, she gasped. Gates, gates, gates. Pod and Homily stared at each other across Arrietty's bowed shoulders. You didn't ought to have brought it up, he said unhappily. Not so late at night. Arrietty raised her tear-streaked face. Late or early, what's the difference, she cried. Oh, I know Papa is a wonderful borrower. I know we've managed to stay when all the others have gone. But what has it done for us? In the end, I don't think it's so clever to live on alone, forever and ever, in a great big half-empty house, under the floor, with no one to talk to, no one to play with, nothing to see but dust and passages, no light but candlelight and firelight and what comes through the cracks. Eglantine had brothers, and Eglantine had half-brothers. Eglantine had a tame mouse. Eglantine had yellow boots with jet buttons. And Eglantine did get out, just once. Shush, said Pod gently, not so loud. Above their heads, the floor creaked, and heavy footfalls heaved deliberately to and fro. They heard Mrs. Driver's grumbling voice and the clatter of the fire irons. Drat this stove, they heard her say. Wind's in the east again. Then they heard her raise her voice and call, Cramp Furl! Pod sat staring glumly at the floor. Arrietty shivered a little and hugged herself more tightly into the knitted quilt, and Homily drew a long, slow breath. Suddenly she raised her head. The child is right, she announced firmly. Arrietty's eyes grew big. Oh no, she began. It shocked her to be right. Parents were right, not children. Children could say anything. Arrietty knew and enjoyed saying it, knowing they were always safe and wrong. You see, Pod, went on Homily, it was different for you and me. There was other families, other children, the Sinks in the scullery, you remember, and those people who lived behind the knife machine. I forget their names now. And the broom cupboard boys. And there was that underground passage from the stables, you know, that the rain pipes used. We had more, as you might say, freedom. Ah, yes, said Pod, in a way, but where does freedom take you? He looked up uncertainly. And where are they all now? Some of them have bettered themselves, I shouldn't wonder, said Homily sharply. Times have changed in the whole house. Pickings aren't what they were. There were those that went, you remember, when they dug a trench for the gas pipe, over the fields and through the wood and all, a kind of tunnel it gave them, all the way to Leighton Buzzard. And where did they find? And what did they find there? Said Pod unkindly. A mountain of coke? Homily turned away. Arrietty, she said in the same firm voice, supposing one day we'd pick a special day when there was no one about, and providing they don't get a cat, which I have my reasons for thinking they won't, supposing one day your father took you out borrowing, you'd be a good girl, wouldn't you? You'd do just what he said, quickly and quietly and no arguing. Ariadne turned quite pink. She clasped her hands together. Oh, she began in an ecstatic voice, but Pod cut in quickly. Now, Homily, we got to think. You can't just say things like that without thinking it out proper. I been seen, remember? This is no kind of time for taking a child upstairs. There won't be a cat, said Homily. There wasn't no screeching. It's not like that time with Rosa Pickhatchet. All the same, said Pod uncertainly. The risk's there. I never heard of no girl going borrowing before. The way I look at it, said Homily, and it's only now it's come to me. If you had a son, you'd take him borrowing, now wouldn't you? Well, you haven't got no son, only... Only garantizados superiores. I think I'm on the wrong page. Only, sorry. Ariadne, suppose anything happened to you or me, where would Ariadne be if she hadn't learned to borrow? Pod sat down at his knees. Yes, he said after a moment, I see what you mean. And it'll give her a bit of interest like and stop her hankering. Hankering for what? For blue sky and grass and such like? Ariadne caught her breath and Homily turned on her swiftly. It's no good, Ariadne. I'm not going to emigrate. Not for you nor anyone else. Ah, said Pod and began to laugh. So that's it. Shh, said Homily, annoyed, and glanced quickly at the ceiling. Not so loud. Now kiss your father, Ariadne. She went on briskly, and pop off back to bed. As Ariadne snuggled down under the bedclothes, she felt creeping up from her toes a glow of happiness, like a glow of warmth. She heard their voices rising and falling in the next room. Homilies went on, measured and confident. There was, Ariadne felt, a kind of conviction behind it. It was the winning voice. Once she heard Pod get up and the scrape of the chair. I don't like it, she heard him say. And she heard Homily whisper, Hush! And there were tremulous footfalls on the floor above, and the sudden clash of pans. Ariadne, half dozing, gazed up at her painted ceiling. Flor de Havana, proclaimed the banners proudly. Here's her room. I think she's in a cigar box. Garantizados superiores non plus ultra exquisitos, and the lovely gauzy ladies blew their trumpets silently, triumphantly, and soundless notes of glee. The end. I hope you enjoyed chapter 6. We'll go to chapter 7 next.